I'm delighted to be joined here today by Nat Friedman. Nat is a serial entrepreneur. He founded Zimian, which he sold to Novell, and then Xamarin, which was acquired by Microsoft, and then as part of Microsoft, helped lead the acquisition of GitHub, and is now the CEO of GitHub. So Nat, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe just to kick off, I mean, not to make you feel old or anything, but it feels like you have been in the software.
You make me feel old frequently.
You have a fabulous skincare routine, but it feels like you've been in the software industry forever. Like, I imagine we could dig up, the mailing list flame wars between you and Charles Babbage, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you became a developer and why.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So I grew up in a small town in Virginia, and neither of my parents, and really no one I knew had any interest in computers or science or technology. But I had terrible handwriting, and so when I was really young, my dad decided to buy me a computer so I could type. And it was an Apple IIe, and I sort of discovered that when you booted it up, it booted into a BASIC interpreter, and so you could start coding. And the sort of skies parted and the lights shone down, and there was a moment when I realized this would be the rest of my life. And so that was sort of significant moment number one. And I didn't have to be good at sports or talk to people. I could just use my computer, and it's very, very comforting. And then,
so what age were you when you talked to your last person?
This might be the last moment now. No. So I was 6 years old when I started first writing code in BASIC on this Apple II, and it was so great that when you bought a computer back then, it actually came with everything you needed to be a programmer, in a sense, literally in the ROM in the case of the Apple IIs. So I sort of have Steve Wozniak and Apple to thank for that foundation for me. And then the next significant moment for me was in the early 90s when I first got connected to the internet. And basically what I did was, in my small town in Virginia, there was a university, the University of Virginia, and I got a program installed on my computer that would dial every phone number in the town. And so
this was legal back then.
And anyway,
you did.
Yeah. So my family went on vacation, and I left the modem dialing, all 10,000 numbers in the exchange, and it's called war dialing, but it was a very peaceful activity. And when you came back, it would sort of show you which ones had answered with a person saying hello, hello, or which ones, had a fax machine and which ones had a modem. Yeah. And there was it was an image that it would generate, and there was this long line of red dots that indicated a bank of modems. And I said, oh, this is interesting. So I dialed into those, and the University of Virginia had open access modems for the internet, for internet access. And so I started using Linux in '93 or so, and connected to the internet, and that was the big moment, because suddenly I wasn't just this developer working alone anymore. I got connected to what eventually became known as the open source community, and I got to get in touch with developers from all over the world who were writing software and code, and I got to learn from them. And so for a kid from Virginia with sort of no natural connections to any of these communities, I had the option of joining the world's best communities for software development. And I remember just being awed by the fact that I could work with a developer in England and a developer in Hawaii, all kind of from my computer in Virginia. So that was the beginning of it for me.
So you've kind of been living the GitHub distributed open source development experience in a way for the last kind of 20, 25 years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I deeply identify with the idea that now, thanks to the internet, every kid who's born anywhere in the world isn't limited to the choice of communities that are just happen to be in that location. They can join the communities that they're most interested in online. And GitHub is great because it's kind of paved the road for this entire process for every community on Earth. It's sort of the driveway that used to lead to each open source community used to be a kind of rutted dirt road, and now they've all been paved by the pull request and the sort of standard interface that GitHub put in front of all these open source communities.
Yeah, I'm curious to talk about GitHub a bit, because you started, as you describe in this, with semi-legal, software engineering activity, and I think it was in the Dark Knight Rises. They said you either die a programmer or live long enough to see yourself become the business guy. You started in this world in the '90s, and you now work at. Well, technically, you're an employee of Microsoft, and you led the GitHub acquisition. So, what made it obvious to you that GitHub was so valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably there's some similarity between the motivation to buy GitHub for $7.5 billion and the motivation you had to create Stripe.
We launched Stripe corporate card, by the way, if you're looking to make more purchases.
Oh, good. Yeah. It wasn't available at the time, or we would have gotten that cash back, which would have been really nice. But I think the recognition in the world of companies, if you look at the trillions of dollars that are spent on IT every year, still most of that money is directed by IT departments and CIOs who make infrastructure decisions from a kind of business and IT perspective. And the big shift that I think Stripe is at the forefront of is the movement of decision-making power into developers' hands. And really, developers are kind of building the infrastructure for civilization today. And more of our life and more of our work is mediated by software. And kind of one of the ways I think about this is, there's this long history of human civilization where major things happened without software, like the invention of gunpowder or algebra or all these other types of events, and that's over. Like, all the things that happen in the future that involve, that are major events will have software in them in one way or another. And so developers are becoming incredibly empowered, and I think they're probably the most or one of the most valuable talent pools of the next century. And so this idea that Microsoft is a 40-year-old company and incredibly successful, $110 billion in annual revenue, still mostly was built on this older IT-driven world, and there's a clear recognition that developers are going to be making more and more of the decisions in the future. And developers love GitHub, and developers love open source and building on open source. Balaji earlier said, every tech company almost every major tech company uses open source in their stack. I mean, I would push that much further. It's hard to find a software project that's not built on open, unless you're building software for like a nuclear submarine. And even then,
probably like a bunch of NPM modules or something.
Right.
It's like, yeah. No, we absolutely see that the decision-making authority moving further and further towards the developer. And one trend we see that I think is really exciting within enterprises, I don't know if you see it too, is the classic big company RFP process where you spend a very long period going through the Excel spreadsheet of requirements really selects for you the person who can say yes to the largest number of your requests. And saying yes to the largest number of your requests is not always correlated with having the best product or even those yeses actually being particularly true. I mean, they're true in some kind of tortured way or theoretical way, but not being true. And so what we're starting to see is companies kind of doing a formal hackathon RFP. I've encountered a few of these of late where they say, OK, we're going to carve off some resources, see how much we can get built as a proof of concept in 4 weeks.
Yep.
And that way we can actually see, as we project out 3 years from now, where might we be with these software tools? But I think that's a pretty exciting trend.
Yeah, I think that's super exciting. I mean, Paul Graham is famously called APIs self-serve business development, which I think is totally right. But the other way to look at it is there's this new stakeholder inside every company, which is the developers. And if you go in and you try to sort of present something to the company that doesn't actually meet the satisfaction of the developers, you'll have a hard time getting sold. And the only way to satisfy them is to build great tools, build great services that are developer-friendly, that put developers first. I think launching a command line tool today is a great example of that. And so that was one of the principles for me as we were completing the acquisition of GitHub, was that we had to always put developers first. And specifically what that meant, there were sort of 2 important corollaries to that in our case. One was that that we would always have to preserve developer choice. And so GitHub would have to be a completely, though it's owned by a parent company, Microsoft, it would have to be completely technology neutral, cloud neutral, operating system neutral, device neutral, language neutral.
Which people weren't used to from Microsoft, even though Microsoft has gotten much more in that.
Yeah, I think Microsoft's really transformed itself into one of the world's largest open source native companies in many, many ways. And I think lots of people have been impressed by that transformation, including me. But that's not historically how Microsoft's behaved, where there's been a strong sort of platform tax type of activity. And so, today's Microsoft really gets that, and I think, so that sense of developer choice is key. And then the other is that, we made the decision early on that GitHub would continue to run as an independent company, and that's really to be able to preserve that kind of reputation and make sure that we're making decisions that are for developers kind of at every step along the way.
If we talk about your history a bit with Stripe. So maybe for those of you who don't know, Nat, I was going back and doing some Googling as research for this. By the way, I noticed you deleted your blog. Did you write some terribly incriminating stuff?
It was really bad, yeah.
Okay, yeah, maybe a guide to war dialing or something like that. But anyway, before Nat's blog was deleted, you wrote a blog post way back in 2011. So this was before Stripe launched, when we were in private beta and nobody had heard of us. And Nat wrote a blog post called instant company, where he was describing how much kind of easier starting his second company was than starting his first company. And this was a huge deal for us as an 8-person unlaunched company. I don't know if I ever told you this. It's incredibly embarrassing, but we're using this analytics software, Chartbeat, and a traffic alert went off because so much new traffic was coming to the site. I was going back in my email just yesterday before this talk, and I saw the traffic alert that it's like, John, don't freak out, but there are 20 visitors to the Stripe website right now. That was the traffic alert email that we got from Chartbeat. But anyway, in it, you said that you're talking about these various tools that you discovered, and one of these was Stripe, and that Stripe was going to take over the world. And one, sadly, we have not taken over the world. I mean, as you see with the announcements, we are getting there with the express coverage and the general coverage, but we still have many countries to go. But I guess, what was it that stood out to you, and what maybe stands out to you when you look for companies that might take off today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing was just I had recently built a website using PayPal, and it was extremely painful. And then, when I got access to Stripe, it was super easy, and as a developer, it just felt like everything was speaking natively to me. The API was incredibly friendly, easy, it sort of all made sense. It wasn't some set of payment concepts that I had to grasp that were foreign to me, or some big complex concept hierarchy. And so you got developers, and that was super obvious. And then, the experience of working with the folks at Stripe was great because I just jumped in an IRC chat room, with a bunch of other folks at Stripe, and the sort of customer service was next level. And I think right after we launched and we started doing our first charges through Stripe, we received a handwritten letter from John and Patrick, that was saying, hey, thanks for being a customer. And it's like, okay, they get developers, they're always on customer support, and they're customer obsessed and sent us this nice letter. So all that made a ton of sense to me. But I think the main thing is just that Stripe sort of addresses, for many businesses, the challenge of, how do you launch new businesses and iterate in a way where you can be really agile? And that's still what Stripe is doing today. And so, for example, we're now using Stripe to power GitHub Sponsors, which is our program to enable open source developers around the world to get sponsorship for the work that they're doing and support their work, for the folks who are depending on their work to be able to sort of thank and recognize them monetarily for that. That's really made possible and scalable through Stripe. And so I think that was present in the sort of early founding of Stripe.
And Sponsors is so interesting, right? Because so much mission-critical software gets built by the open source community, and for so long the support model has been, sometimes people start a commercial company that kind of, if it feels like giving things back, but it's incredible when you contrast how much we depend on open source software and the casualness of the funding model. And so it feels like Sponsors could really make a big difference there.
Yeah, I think that's just going to change. The last 25 years of open source have been so fascinating because I think 25 years ago, open source was this almost offshoot of the academic process of doing research and publishing. It began in universities and places like MIT, and now it's really 98% of the code and any of the products you're shipping are open source components you install via NPM or some other package registry. And so that open source is now powering kind of all the software that people build, and yet I think the kind of incentive models around open source haven't caught up. So most full-time contributors to open source are full-time contributors because some company hires them to contribute to open source full-time. And usually it's a moment of a company like Intel or Microsoft or a bank waking up and saying, wow, we all depend on this and no one works on it full-time, but if it stops working, our company will be in deep trouble. Maybe we should hire someone to do this. And it strikes us at GitHub that there's an opportunity for there to be other funding models besides just full-time employment at incidental users of open source components. But why shouldn't an open source component pay you, right? Why shouldn't an open source project that you work on, it's like a subreddit that you can join, but it pays you when you type into it. And so I think that's the experiment we're beginning with GitHub Sponsors, and it's been growing something like 100% month over month since we launched it, and we're incredibly excited about it. We've got folks around the world we have people who if we pay late, they don't make rent, and so we're excited to be kind of driving that one forward in more countries now thanks to Stripe.
It feels like there might be a head version of this strategy as well, where when you think about some of the critical components, if you're Google, you can just invest in developing proprietary versions of your distributed database or your locking service or whatever, and then other people are relying on open source software that may not make have enough investment compared to the level of impact, and so there might be like an X prize type model for GitHub.
Yeah, I think there's going to be
core problems.
Different payment models that will exist over time. So I think sponsorship, the idea of patronage and sort of a subscription-based sponsorship of individuals is one model. I think community-based sponsorship is another. And I think there should be ROI attached to that for the companies investing. And so, for example, to have a better relationship with that community, to make sure you can have some kind of conversation. I think the bounty model is also an interesting one that's worth exploring, where a bunch of people can get together and say, gosh, here's a spec, and if someone would fix this bug or implement this feature, to me that's worth $100, and you might say that's worth $50 to me, and sort of this bounty can accumulate that anyone can go out there and collect. We've seen that model work well for security with HackerOne. HackerOne is now doing sort of bounty-based pen testing.
Where the outcomes are very well defined.
The outcomes are well defined, and the coordination burden is very low. So, a hacker who wants to pen test a given site actually shouldn't know anything about the site. So there's no sort of onboarding step. Now, if we can kind of reduce those coordination costs for other forms of software development, and there's folks who are doing experiments around code review as a service, bounty-based development. I think these are all really interesting ideas. And so one of the ways, if we sort of translate GitHub's mission into Stripe vocabulary, we would say that our mission is to kind of reduce the transaction costs for developer cooperation globally, so that anyone can cooperate with anyone else or become a contributor to a project one way or another, with low setup costs or low friction. And I think adding these incentive models, sort of cash as a first-class concept on GitHub, is an experiment that may help with that.
Can't tell if it's a backhanded compliment if we were to put our mission in Stripe vocabulary, kind of in an abstract and hard to understand way. You noted the kind of the handwritten note there when we launched. We did, right? Our hands were sore after that. By the way, there's now a startup that will, a robot will write large numbers of handwritten notes.
I'm not sure that's quite the same.
So sadly, yeah, it's not quite, kind of maybe missing the point. But I think in general, this is something that we certainly obsess over, kind of listening to customers and using that to inform product development. Patrick called this a listening conference. And I saw, you tweeted a while back that Nat asked people to call him just on his way to work to talk about, their experience with GitHub. So it's like comedians in cars grabbing coffee, but I guess it's like CEOs in cars collecting customer commentary. But so I guess, did that work? Is it scalable? Do you have non-automotive channels? Like, do you think bars with anyone, or?
That was really fun, actually. I wish somebody would start a company to facilitate that for people who who don't have a Twitter following or whatever.
A Tesla app on the
It was bad because I had to look through my Twitter DMs to find the phone numbers while I was driving, so that wasn't good. But other than that, it was great. No, I just sort of was. I had a 40-minute drive ahead of me, and I said, "Hey, if anybody wants to talk about GitHub, DM me your phone number, and I'll call you." And I had, I think, 5 or 6 conversations in those 40 minutes, and 4 of them happened to be with GitHub customers who had feedback they urgently wanted to provide to me, which was great. So no, I think one of the things we try to do at GitHub is to be really customer obsessed, and there's lots of different sources of signal that a product team can have when they make decisions about what to build next. And I think one of the sources of signal that's great is to have intuitive sort of insight into, if you're the user of the product, you have a good idea of what it should do next that it doesn't do. You don't have to talk to anyone. And I think there's a lot of companies, I'd say Snapchat seems to be very creativity and intuition driven, and like that's a great model. But I think talking to your customers is also like a really powerful way to get a better understanding of people who aren't like you. And when you have larger and larger enterprise customers, I think that becomes more and more important. And so that's one of the things I've tried to encourage at GitHub. So I do, for example, every Friday I'll do a 2-hour open video chat with a bunch of open source maintainers, and I probably do personally 5 or so enterprise customer briefings a week, and I do all that to kind of set an example for the organization.
I think it was you also, I remember mentioning, and it really struck me, the value of the group session, because then everyone riffs off each other, right?
Yeah, that's really great. That's if you can have a bunch of customers, it sounds like a focus group, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like a conversation.
Yeah. It's like not calling things webinars. It's just like
never say that word. No, it's a live stream event.
Yeah, exactly.
But someone will throw an idea in, and someone else will say, "Oh, we have that, and here's how we handle it," and then everyone's learning from each other, and you create community too. So those are great.
Yeah. OK, so you're gathering the customer input. Then in terms of actually taking into product development, I think my impression from the outside and many other people's has just been GitHub has shipped so much stuff in the past year. And so what changed?
Well, I think we've been really focused on trying to give customers what they want, and I think one of
that's presumably what every CEO says.
Yeah,
we're about unlocking value for blah blah blah.
Yeah, I think I think the main thing that we had at GitHub is because you've got 40 million developers, there's a sense of stage fright that you can have as a developer at GitHub. GitHub is so valued by the community that uses it.
Every change seems too big?
Yeah, it's like, every change you've got to go to the giant stadium and sort of get in front of the entire audience and say, here's the change we made to how pull requests work. And there was sort of some anxiety about how that would be received. And so I think one of the things we've tried to unlock is this concept of ship to learn, where there are ways of shipping things where we can get feedback from users in conversation that are lower risk, and accepting some level of risk that maybe you'll do something that's not perfect, and then quickly adjust. And that's actually how you build trust. So
I remember the story of your first day at GitHub when you joined, and maybe forming impressions with people as the new CEO, and you walked in, people had plans, and you said, okay, what can we ship today? And presumably that sets some out of the cadence, and that gets at that ship to learn idea.
That is true, and like one of the things that I actually learned from that. So one of the things we did early on at GitHub is we launched a program called paper cuts, and the idea of paper cuts was to identify sort of small, like nothing that you would ever prioritize highly on a product roadmap, but small irritants that we could easily fix quickly, and then just start doing a bunch of those. And so we sort of accelerated that program, and I did, that sort of story is true, and we ended up shipping that week 3 different paper cuts. And it had these sort of 3 really great virtuous cycles for me, or these feedback loops. The first was a sense of external momentum that our developers and our community saw. Like, oh, wow, GitHub's doing things. Like, this seems good. Maybe I should provide them feedback so they'll do more things. And the second for me, was the internal momentum inside the company, where it was exciting. People were excited by all these little things that we were doing, and it started to create sort of momentum. And then I think the third was, for me, just the sense of being able to learn quickly what we were good at and what we weren't, and sort of which parts of the company were doing a great job and which parts needed some improvement. And if you have like one giant plan that involves shipping something in 9 months, you kind of don't learn all those things for 9 months. And so I think as a leader, I've undervalued momentum and cheap wins in the past. Like, cheap wins have always seemed like cheap. And now I value that a lot more. Like, I think momentum is actually critical to organizations being successful overall. So.
Yeah, there is probably a phenomenon of just like, the theories that language informs thought, the structures that companies use to talk about product releases, the altitude at which they talk about them probably affects the work they do. And so, yeah, I really like the paper cuts phenomenon. We have something that's kind of vaguely related, which is, we will talk about the product doing a new thing, and that's kind of the language people are used to. And so Express should now support more countries, or, we should do ID verification and things like that. That's all fine, but we actually recently introduced this concept of product quality scores. And so as we're reviewing products and product progress, that could take the form of like the product doing more things, but also the product quality scores will be people going through the common flows and just being like, oh, this interaction was really laggy, or the copy was a bit meandering here, or something like that. And again, I think that's, if you're just kind of thinking in feature and functionality terms, you'll miss just the tactile experience of using it, and was it pleasant.
Yeah, I think if your product's in someone's daily experience, they sort of live in it every day, then those little irritants add up much more quickly. And they're never the thing they'll report to you when they talk to you, because they think I should report something really big, a missing capability or this or that. But they end up having like a huge effect on people's sort of sense of working with the product.
Yeah, yeah. And retention and engagement, they'll kind of, their input metrics.
Now, I would say latency is in that category. So like no customer will ever say, gosh, if you could cut 200 milliseconds off your page load time, I will like your product better.
But it'll show up in the metrics.
It'll show up. Well, they'll prefer your snappier competitor, any day, because they're just a little faster.
Yeah. So GitHub has 130 million repositories across 40 million users. I mean, just the scale of code is incredible. And so it is now time to move to our lightning round, where we have just kind of meticulously gone through these 130 million repositories and gotten a bunch.
Oh, no.
So this game is, I'm going to tell you a repository, and you tell me if it is a real repository on GitHub or if I just made it up. So we'll start with is13, a node module that checks whether a number is 13.
Oh my god. I'm gonna go with that's real.
It's real. It has 125 contributors and a code of conduct policy. Pop-up trombone, a trombone you play by resizing the browser window.
Oh, that's a great idea. If it's not real, it should be. I'm gonna go with that's real.
It is real, so you're 2 for 2. S1 scanner, a script where you input the HTML file from an S1, and it does a word frequency analysis and outputs the target price for the S1.
Oh my god, that sounds like something you would want.
Yeah, no, I made that up. I'm sorry.
Okay.
B++, a programming language made entirely from words and phrases from Beyoncé songs.
It's possible. I'm going to go with fake, though.
Oh, wow, 4 for 4. That is fake.
Oh.
And then lastly, Volkswagen, a plugin that detects whether your tests are running in a CI environment and just makes them all pass.
It should exist if it doesn't.
But real or fake?
Let's go with real.
5 for 5. You are clearly the...
All right. Wow.
Like pulling the sword from the stone. That is how Nat finally became the CEO.
That's right. That's how it happened.
You were just interim CEO until this moment.
Satya did that exact same quiz. That's why I knew the answers, actually.
So shifting gears completely, I think you strike everyone here in the audience as just a man with not enough to do, probably really getting through a lot of the Netflix queue. And so in your spare time, you co-founded an organization called California YIMBY. And obviously, we've been involved as a backer of that organization. But maybe you can tell us a bit about what led you to do that and the work that they're using.
Yeah, I mean, I moved to San Francisco about 9 years ago, something like that. And when my wife and I got here, we'd moved most recently from Germany. She's German. And I think one of the and we'd spent a bunch of time traveling. But when we got to San Francisco, one of the sort of really shocking things was the quantity and sort of misery level of the homeless situation in San Francisco. And I remember spending like my first couple of weeks here just noticing how many signs of kind of indignity and distress there were on the streets, and asking the people that I knew, hey, what's going on? Like, why are there so many homeless people in San Francisco, and what's being done about it? And just being deeply dissatisfied with everyone's answers. I mean, people would sort of harken back to Reagan as governor, making some policy changes around mental health, and I was like, yeah, but that was a few decades ago. Like, what about in the intervening 30 years? Has anyone done anything? And so sort of this general sense of, okay, I'm doing this company now, but like at some point I really want to understand this problem better and maybe try to do something about it. And then in starting a company in San Francisco and having employees here, even in the incredibly lucky and privileged tech industry where we pay, we try to pay really well, seeing that the cost of housing for our employees here in San Francisco was the sort of #1 source of drama in their lives, where it was expensive, or as they were having kids and entering a new stage of life, they wanted to sort of move out of the city and try to find somewhere else to live. And so I thought, well, my gosh, if tech people are struggling with this, the rest of the population is really feeling it. And so in about 2 years ago, together with some friends that I met on Twitter, who were sort of also interested in these housing policy issues, we decided one day to just drive to Sacramento and talk to the government and say, like, we've got to do something about this.
Mr. Smith goes to Washington.
Yeah, sort of like, and literally no plan. We put on suits, but...
Did you own a suit?
I had a suit, but I wore sneakers. And then we got to Sacramento, and no appointments. So we just started sort of knocking on doors of senators and assembly members. And we went to the governor's office. He was on a trip, so he wasn't there. So we didn't plan that very well. But we ended up meeting with a number of people, and it was sort of like shocking how easy that was to do. So we had 3 meetings with assembly members. We met with 2 senators. And there was a bill that the governor had on housing that was live at that time. And we met with the opposition to the bill somehow. Like, we just showed up and did that. And they told us their feedback on the bill, and so then we went to the governor's office and met with the staff who were working on the bill and gave them the feedback that we'd heard. Suddenly we were sort of in the middle of this thing, and we were like, okay, you can just drive to Sacramento and get some government. Like, everybody should do this. And so there was a strong sense that there was no one advocating for increasing housing production in California.
And that's the fundamental insight, right?
That was the big insight, yeah.
We're in a housing crisis, and California and San Francisco in particular, there is not enough housing being built. Like, you don't have to overthink it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's definitely the backdrop is, throughout the Bay Area, there are 101 different cities or municipalities, each of which has a separate government, and there's no regional government in the Bay Area. And kind of together, they're all collectively failing to build more housing. And so we thought, okay, well, we have to go to the unit of government that is sort of above all these cities and try to drive change in that way. Because if there's more housing, supply-demand curves will mean that probably more people will be able to live here, and at some tiers it'll become more affordable. And so that was the impetus behind it, and we've actually had great support from companies like Stripe and many other people in the Bay Area who also want to see this change. And we've actually passed a number of bills now. Next step was to crack
That's the most
open.
impressive thing. I mean, YIMBY is a relatively new organization, and there's already a lot of legislation being passed in large part thanks to YIMBY's efforts.
Yeah, and I think it's a multi-year sort of process, but we're really excited about the policy changes we've been able to see already, and I think we'll have to keep at it.
So I think there's probably a lot of people here who care about the homeless situation in San Francisco, who care about the general lack of housing in San Francisco and kind of pushing this issue forward. How can they help?
I think that the fact of the matter is most of the people who are sort of speaking out or engaged are the people who are already homeowners and have a lot of time on their hand and kind of don't want there to be more homeowners or more people living here. And so the rest of us are busy. We have jobs and we're doing things. And so I think I would look for, there's YIMBY groups now. YIMBY is sort of the inversion of NIMBY. NIMBY is not in my backyard, and YIMBY is sort of the affirmative version, which is yes in my backyard. And so there are YIMBY groups now in basically every city. I would encourage you to find your local YIMBY group, join it. Sometimes just phone calls, emails, letters at the right time really make a difference. You can make a donation to one of those groups, or if you want to get involved at the state level and you believe in that strategy, you can join California YIMBY as a member, and we have lots of calls to action that we send out, and fundraising events and other ways that people can get involved. But there's very few people doing this, and that was the sort of discovery of that trip to Sacramento. And so each incremental person actually makes a pretty big difference, and a high leverage, now gigantic California economy. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe just to close us out, it's been really fun for me to watch the scale of GitHub and the kind of things people are doing. And so, we covered some of those 130 million repositories already, 3 real ones and 2 fake ones. But when we think of the actual software development that's happening on GitHub, I mean, just what gets you personally most excited? Is it like the recent black hole stuff that was done that maybe you can tell people about, or just what gets you jumping out of bed?
Yeah, I mean, that was a great story that I loved. So back in April of this year, some scientists working in groups around the world between Europe and the US published the first ever photo of a black hole. And probably... It
was on the front page of all the newspapers. It was
probably everyone saw it. I think they told us they estimated something like 4 billion people saw the photo, so it's like one of the most seen photos, probably of the last 20 years or so. And I was thinking, why was that such a charismatic moment that caught the imagination of so many people? And I think, in a way, humanity kind of needed a win at that moment. Here we are in this sort of divisive period, and these scientists from around the world used telescopes that were placed all over the planet to gather kind of tons of signal from this one teeny spot kind of in outer space and made this image. And so it was just this feel-good thing. And so anyway, the news was announced, the photo was out. And I read in one of the news articles that the developers had actually written the code on GitHub that they'd used to kind of compose all the satellite data into this image. So I went looking for the repo that contained the code, and I found it. And they'd written the code in Python. And it wasn't that long. It was sort of a small number of thousands of lines of Python code. And I was looking at the dependency graph of that code and discovered that they'd used a whole bunch of different open source Python libraries to write the code. So they'd used NumPy, and they'd used Pandas and Matplotlib and all these other types of libraries, but they'd also used some astronomical processing libraries, like one called AstroPy that computes the Hubble time delta between all these different locations.
Use it all the time, yeah.
Yeah, super commonly used.
Yeah.
And so we got in touch with the team that did it, and they were super excited to talk to GitHub because, sort of from their perspective, they said, we never could have built what we built if it weren't for the community of people building open source, many of whom live on GitHub. And so we decided to sort of run the query and find out, OK, how many GitHub users contributed to code that they depended on, right? So there were about 14 people who'd contributed to the black hole processing code itself, direct members of the Event Horizon Telescope team. But if we sort of found the transitive closure of all their 100 Python dependencies and we added up all the contributors to those, the number turned out to be 25,000 or 25,000 GitHub users who'd contributed code to this project. And I just found that to be incredibly beautiful in a way, because it really meant that sort of intellectual work is fractal. it really, it takes a community to build code, and like every line of code that we write is actually building on the work of thousands of other people who kind of came before us and did this work and put it out there for free for us to build on. So that's my favorite story right now about the kind of and the image that we have of a developer is of the solitary kind of lone developer in a dark room, antisocial, introverted, writing code on their own, like just me at 6 years old. And yet, I think that stereotype is false, because, in fact, software development is this kind of global team sport where we're all working together to write code together. And you can see that very clearly in the Black Hole project.
And on that note, Nat, thank you.
Thanks, John.